Mr. Martin was an old man. He lived alone in an old wooden house nestled on the edge of a frozen lake near British Columbia. He had served for years as a wildlife ranger before finally retiring and choosing to embrace nature. Every winter morning, he would take a walk along the lakeshore, covered in light snow, breathing in the cold air and listening to the heart of silence. That morning, too, the sky was gray and the ground was pristine white. Freshly fallen snow had enveloped the landscape like a blanket. Just as he was finishing his walk along the lakeshore, he was startled by a faint sound in the distance. It wasn't a bird call, nor a wolf's howl. It was a cry. He focused on the sound. It came from the center of the lake. He moved slowly and his heart leaped when he saw the sight. A baby elephant was trapped beneath the ice. Yes, a small elephant, probably slipping where the ice had broken while trying to drink, only to be trapped beneath the frozen water again. His eyes were filled with fear. His long trunk stretched out onto the frozen ice, his forelegs digging into the surface. But he couldn't get out. His body was trembling. He had clearly been there for hours. Martin averted his gaze. There was no human or animal nearby. There was no one he could call for help. He was alone. But time was short. If he didn't do something, this tiny life would vanish there, silently before his eyes. He made a decision instinctively. He ran home. From his closet, he retrieved a sturdy rope, a long grappling hook, and a wooden shovel he used to use. He packed them all into a backpack and returned to the lakeshore. Every second was crucial now. When he reached it, the elephant calf was still in the same place. Their eyes met. Martin knelt down and tied the rope to a tree. He wrapped the other end around his waist. Then, lying down, he carefully moved forward, sliding the shovel in front of him. The ice was cracking. Every step posed a threat, every crack a warning. But he didn't stop. The elephant calf watched. Tears streamed from his eyes, and his trunk sniffed the frozen surface nervously. It was as if he were saying, "Come, but be careful." As Martin approached the crack in the ice, he planted his knees on the solid spot. He carefully inserted the end of the stick under the ice and guided it toward the baby elephant's trunk. Now all he had to do was give it a chance to hold on. As he approached, he carefully extended the hook on the end of the pole and tried to pull the elephant calf's hind leg out of the ice. He slipped on the first try, but on the second, he secured it. The calf's trunk, emerging from the icy water, touched Martin's arm as if trying to hold on. It lightly scratched Martin's glove. The silent contact between them held a mixture of fear and hope. At that moment, the ice beneath Martin cracked violently. The cold water splashing up from the ice splashed across his face. He gasped. He leaned on the shovel to maintain his balance. From now on, they would both be buried in the ice. Or the miracle would happen. "Come on," he whispered to himself, straining his arms with all his strength. He shifted his weight back, leaned on the rope, and began to pull the elephant calf. The elephant's body slowly slid onto the ice. He had stopped struggling. He was exhausted. He was motionless. His body was completely soaked, his skin a dull gray. Martin quickly removed his coat. His own body shivering with cold, he draped his large coat over the cub like a blanket. He wrapped the small body around him, then lifted him into his arms. Even though the elephant's weight strained his back, he took a step back, then another. Each step, struggling against the snow, dragged him toward the shore. The cold wind howled like a scream. His shoulders were numb, his knees ached, but he didn't stop. He walked, and finally he reached the door of his lakeside cabin. He kicked open the door. The first thing he did upon entering was to pile dry wood into the fireplace and light a large fire. As the flames began to rise, he gently laid the cub down on the rug. As the warmth of the fire spread throughout the room, Martin began to rub his hands over the cub's frozen legs, gently, slowly, rhythmically. Minutes later, he saw a slight stirring. The elephant's trunk trembled. His eyelids opened. He looked at Martin with a deep, silent gaze. He was still full of fear, but now there was a glimmer of confidence inside him. Martin named him Snowy. When he found him, his body was covered in pure white snow. He looked like a snow sculpture. Snowy was still timid. He lifted his head, but then leaned back against the carpet. Martin went into the kitchen. He warmed some milk. He began feeding him with a small ladle and a soft cloth. Then he dried Snowy's skin with a soft towel. He threw more wood into the fireplace. A peaceful warmth permeated the room. That night, he placed an old blanket and pillow in a corner of the living room. This was now Snowy's domain. Every morning he cooked porridge, adding a little honey to it to make a nourishing mixture. Gradually, the elephant calf began to recover. First, he lifted his head, then he sat down, then he began exploring the house. One day, as Martin was reading in his armchair, Snowy slowly approached. He rested his trunk on his knee. Then he gently rubbed his head against his hand. At that moment, a smile appeared on Martin's face that had not been seen for a long time. As the days passed, Snowy regained not only his body, but also his spirit. His eyes were now more lively, his movements freer. Martin had made it his mission to introduce him to the sounds of the outside world. Every morning they would sit together on the sofa in front of the cabin, listening to the birds chirping and the wind whistling through the trees. "Look, that's the sparrow's call. That's the woodpeckers. Did you hear that?" Martin would say softly. Snowy would tilt his head, prick up his ears, then wrap his trunk around Martin's hand, as if to say, "I understand." At night, if an unfamiliar footstep sounded outside, he would immediately approach the door, only to return to his bed at the sound of Martin's calm voice. The cabin was no longer just a haven, it was a learning ground. But Snowy was a mischievous student. One day he picked up Martin's old leather shoe with his trunk and carried it to the sofa. Then, tilting his head to the side, he looked at Martin as if to say, "Can I chew on this?" Another day he tried to climb onto the sofa. His feet slipped, but he persevered. After a few tries, he managed to climb onto the sofa where Martin was reading. Every evening, Martin would sleep with a book on his knees, Snowy with his head on his. The fireplace crackled, and time seemed to stand still. Once an old man accustomed to solitude and a baby elephant abandoned in the forest. Now they had become friends who warmed each other's souls. Sometimes at night, Martin would stare at the ceiling and sigh, murmuring, "One day, this too will end. You'll have to go, won't you, little friend?" But every morning, the brush of Snowy's trunk against his cheek would remind him that they still had time. Winter slowly retreated. The snow that had enveloped the forest began to thaw. The bird's song grew louder again, and flowers poked through the earth, and Martin made the inevitable decision. Snowy had grown stronger now. He would peel bark from trees by the lake, foraging for food, digging in the ground, even climbing small hills. He belonged to nature, and he must return to it. Martin packed a bag. He placed Snowy's favorite foods, a few towels soaked in familiar scents, and his old blanket inside. Then they left the cabin together. It was the beginning of a silent but profound farewell. They reached the edge of the forest beyond the lake. There they set up a small camp. Snowy sniffed around, brushed the tree trunks with his trunk. This was his world. Every night, Martin sat with him by the campfire. His eyes were always drawn to the depths of the forest. His hope was that Snowy's mother was still out there somewhere. Perhaps she would catch her scent and return. He had deliberately chosen an area near Snowy's birthplace because nature was sometimes filled with miracles. They waited 3 days. The first breeze of spring rippled the leaves. The bird song grew louder. The flowers began to bloom. Time flowed slowly in the depths of the forest. But every morning as Martin opened his eyes, he thought of only one thing. Will today come? During those days of waiting in the forest, Snowy would occasionally raise his trunk and growl lowly. The sound wasn't quite a scream, nor an ordinary gasp. It was more like a call, perhaps a hope, perhaps an instinct. Martin would squint his eyes and look into the distance whenever he heard these sounds. Each time he expected to hear something, but nature remained silent. Until the afternoon of the third day, the sun had left long streaks between the tree trunks and the air had grown warm. Just as Martin bent over to renew the wood fire, a sound came from deep within the forest, a slow but steady snap of twigs, then the rustle of leaves. Martin jerked his head up in a sudden reflex. Snowy had already turned in the direction of the sound. His ears perked up, his body alert. And then, a silhouette emerged from the trees. A large, graceful, and majestic female elephant. Her trunk bore the marks of time, and the edges of her ears were dusty brown. She approached slowly. Every step carried both hesitation and longing. When his eyes met Martin's, it wasn't hard to understand what was going through his mind. Is that my calf? Snowy jumped up. Raising his trunk, he let out his familiar call once more. Then, with a movement that shook his entire body with joy, he began running toward his mother. It was the most beautiful reunion nature has ever written silently. The mother elephant sniffed her calf. First, she examined its face, then its ears, then its trunk. It was as if she were trying to refamiliarize every inch of it. Then she spread her two front legs and pulled Snowy toward her. The calf leaned against her mother's chest, her trunk wrapped around her neck. Her eyes were closed. She was back. Home. Martin stood stock still. Tears welled up in his eyes. He silently took a few steps back. Just witnessing this miracle was sacred enough. A voice inside him said, "Don't come any closer. Don't disturb." This moment belonged to them. When the embrace ended, Snowy turned his head. He looked at Martin. He slowly took a step toward her. He extended his trunk. Martin knelt. Snowy wrapped his trunk around her hand. Then he rubbed again, this time for the last time. Martin patted her head and closed his eyes. "Go now," he said softly. "You're where you belong." The mother elephant stood a few feet away. Her eyes turned to Martin. There was no threat in that look. No fear. Just a thank you. A silent, solemn, sublime thank you. A bond forged between man and beast, beyond words. Snowy turned and went to his mother. Together they began to move, step by step, deeper into the forest. They disappeared among the leaves. It was as if they had never been, as if the wind had simply brought them, and now it was taking them back. Martin stood there at the forest entrance for hours. He didn't speak, he didn't move. He just stared. Not at the emptiness, at the experience. There was both a lack and a profound peace within him. He had saved that little elephant, raised him, and set him free. His hands were cold as he walked home, but his heart was burning like a fireplace flame. That night, Martin opened his little notebook. He turned the pages silently, like a snow wind. With trembling hands, he grasped the pen and wrote a weighty sentence at the top of the page. "Snowy is home now. I'm alone again." But this loneliness wasn't like the loneliness of old. There was a warmth, a sense of completion. He fell asleep thinking about that night. In his mind, he still felt Snowy's tiny trunk in his hand, the farewell look in his eyes. The next morning, with the fresh scent of spring, he opened the door. Just before the wooden steps, a handful of fresh fish lay neatly piled. Next to it, a hollowed-out log was filled with fragrant honey. And in the soft earth, elephant footprints were clearly visible. For a few seconds, Martin said nothing. He simply stared. Then that silent smile slowly appeared at the corners of his lips. "Snowy," he whispered. At first, he thought it was a coincidence in nature. Perhaps it was another animal. But the next day, it came again. This time, there were wild mushrooms and sweet honeycomb-shaped pieces of honey on his doorstep. On the third day, a large pine cone, along with crushed fruit shells and some rare walnuts found in the forest. This continued for a week. Each day, a different gift, each one carefully chosen, natural yet meaningful. Martin no longer doubted it. These gifts weren't just animal instinct. This was the silent echo of a friendship. One night, as he was drinking tea by the fire, he was startled by a faint sound coming from the door. He rose from his chair and walked quietly to the window. The moonlight silvered the cabin's veranda. Peeking through the door, he spotted two shadows at the edge of the distant forest line. Snowy was there. He was bigger now. His body was wider, his stance more proud. His mother was beside him. They stood together. Snowy bowed his head and made a deep, deep sound, as if saying, "I'm here, I haven't forgotten." Then he turned slowly and walked back into the forest. Martin didn't open the door. He didn't shout. He didn't run. He just stood there and smiled. It was a silent pact between them. Trust, gratitude, and freedom, all contained in a single glance. The next morning, Martin placed a small piece of meat on his doorstep. Next to it, he placed a few bright red apples. It was his thank you, and the forest responded silently. The next day, gifts arrived again. More honey, a few mushrooms, a lightly chewed banana peel. One day, a neighbor stopped by and asked Martin, "Do you keep an elephant in your garden?" Martin squinted and looked into the distance. He smiled. Then he simply said, "No, Mm. I have a friend. They understood each other even though they didn't speak. They loved each other even though they didn't share the same language. They had traveled the same path. Snowy had changed his life, but Martin had saved Snowy's. And that's how some friendships are. It needs no chains, no cages, no words. Only the heart, only remembering. A few weeks later, Martin sat down at his desk. He gently placed his hands on his knees, then opened his notebook. Staring at the blank page, he felt a warm sense of peace along with a pang of ache in his heart. He picked up his pen and began writing. His friendship with Snowy, how he saved him, the winter they spent together, and the farewell. This wasn't just a memoir anymore. It was the epitome of a life. And Martin wanted to write this story not just for himself, but for others as well. With every line he wrote, he had one goal: to make this silent bond between an elephant and a human known to more people. After filling the notebook, he collected his notes and sent them to a nearby wildlife sanctuary. Maybe one day, a child would read this story, someone would see it on television, or a nature lover would be inspired. Maybe one day, Snowy's story would touch other lives. But the most important thing for Martin was to make this friendship unforgettable. So he planted a maple sapling right where he'd rescued Snowy from the ice, right there on the lakeshore. A small but graceful tree, growing every year, coming to life every spring. And every spring, Martin continued to leave a few bright red apples under that tree, without saying a word. He'd simply leave them, then pause for a few minutes, listening to the wind, searching for a friendly voice in the rustle of the leaves. Sometimes sitting on the porch of the cabin at night, out of the corner of his eye, he'd think he saw a shadow at the edge of the woods, a vast silhouette, lush and silent. There was a dignity in his bearing. He didn't move, just gazed from afar. Was it Snowy? Maybe. Maybe a dream. But for Martin, what mattered wasn't whether he actually came, but that the bond had never been broken. Because some friendships don't speak, some loves look from afar, and some thanks are given with the silence of an apple. Martin was never alone again. That winter had given meaning to his life. And this story wasn't just a story of a man and an elephant. It was also a story of compassion, loyalty, and silent devotion. Our dear friend, thank you for watching this story. If it touched you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story of true friendship. Stay warm, just like in this story, Mom.